begin by thanking the Honourable Member for Ogmore for bringing this debate forward and for his comprehensive exposition of the matter in his opening speech. The cost of scamming in our society is undoubtedly huge, as we've heard, and it cannot be counted only in pounds, shillings and pence, although the financial cost is significant. Scamming, as we've heard, affects all sections of our communities, but the elderly and other vulnerable members of our communities are at particular risk. The Office for National Statistics predicts that by 2030, the number of elderly people living in our communities will increase by 34%, from 11.6 million to 15.7 million. And the number of people living with dementia will increase from 850,000 to 2.1 million across the UK. We shouldn't forget that the impact of dementia and other impairments makes vulnerability much more pronounced and the ability to target an individual repeatedly much more possible. The Honourable Member for Westmoreland and Lonsdale pointed out about the impact of scams, but it's worth noting that victims of scams are nearly 2.5 times more likely to require increased care provision or to die within 2 years of being scammed. It's also been reported that victims often experience a rapid drop in their physical health after realising that they have been scammed. Now, we've heard today that those who perpetrate scams use sophisticated techniques, and increasingly so, to scam their victims, repeatedly in some cases. Trading Standards, although already hard-pressed, is working on the front line to do all that it can to safeguard the vulnerable. The most sinister, cynical and cruel aspect of scamming is that it is criminal activity which targets those who are most vulnerable in their own homes. The one place where any of us should feel safe becomes the setting for people being conned out of their money via sales scripts, data collection and sometimes even targeted mail. The most common telephone scams are cold calls, and I'm delighted that the government, despite an unnecessary 2-year delay in my view, but the government has finally implemented my 10-minute rule bill in full on nuisance calls, because we know that there is a huge overlap between cold calls and nuisance scams, and the adoption of this bill is a very good start, but of course more needs to be done. As the Honourable Member for Westmoreland and Lonsdale has set out, the impact of scams goes far beyond the financial loss. It is emotional and psychological, and has even been shown to have an impact on our well-being, as has been said by a number of people. The Honourable Member for Ogmore pointed out that it can ruin lives, and indeed we know that it can split up families, with the consequences lasting long beyond the initial trauma of financial loss. Moreover, even when financial losses are comparatively low, scams lead to a breakdown in consumer confidence. The full effects of the harm caused by them is difficult to estimate, as alarmingly, only around 5% of victims report that they have lost money. We know that the average victim is aged around 74 years old, and losses average about £1,000 in each case. But we also know that many more lose hundreds of thousands of pounds in some cases. We know that victims of scams often feel embarrassed and are afraid that their families will judge them if they're older as being no longer capable of living alone. For that reason, scams may not be reported, which leaves the victims open and vulnerable to repeat scams. Some people find it extremely difficult even to admit that they have been victims of a crime. The scale of the problem and its associated costs are huge. Alongside this growing problem, we know that trading standards are struggling to cope, although the work they do is worthy of very high praise indeed and demands our respect. And I also want to highlight the excellent work carried out by the Credit Industry Fraud Avoidance System, or CFAS for short, which works to prevent fraud and financial crime through the sharing of confirmed fraud data. Last year, CFAS prevented more than £1 billion in fraud loss by sharing data across sectors. And its data shows that in my own constituency of North Ayrshire and Arran, 278 frauds took place last year, and there were 103 victims of fraud. We know that this is a mere snapshot of the true level of fraud, which is likely to be much higher because of under-reporting. Scams do more than rob people of their money. They rob them of their confidence, their belief in themselves, in their own judgment, in their self-esteem, their willingness to trust people, and the help they may be able to be offered by others. And ultimately, it robs them of their ability to live full, happy and independent lives. What makes all of us vulnerable to scams is shown by research carried out by Which. The research from Which shows that all of us are overconfident about our ability to spot a scam, and ironically, that overconfidence makes us more vulnerable. The gap between confidence and ability is dangerous. So what can we do? I absolutely agree with the suggestion put forward by Trading Standards that financial institutions should recognise that clients with dementia are by definition more at risk of being scammed, and measures need to be taken to protect that group as a duty of care, and I would argue as a legal duty of care. Those who are diagnosed with dementia live with cognitive impairment, and that has to be recognised as we seek to protect them. The sharing of personal details and information with other organisations, of course, should be a clear opt-in as opposed to an opt-out, and that's an important tool in the fight against scamming. The normal default position of charities and other organisations should be that personal details are not passed on or shared. And although we have legislation in place, I am not convinced from the evidence that I've seen that that has been rigorously adhered to as it should be. It's worth noting that around 850,000 people in the UK currently live with dementia, and by 2030 we know that that figure is set to rise by over 1 million by 2025. And sadly for the scammer, they don't see people who need help and who are vulnerable. They simply see rich pickings, and it's the duty of society to do all it can to protect these vulnerable elderly people. In addition, customers in banks should be able to formally notify their bank in writing if they feel at risk and request that all transactions over a certain amount to new payees have a 24-hour delay before being processed. The Honourable Member for Strangford pointed out his experience of that, and it's time that all banks had a duty, a legal duty to do the same, because that would give time for the proposed transaction to be challenged and potentially stop scammed money from leaving a scam victim's account in the first place. But of course, it's not just the elderly who can be at rich pickings for scamming. In 2015, almost 24,000 people aged under 30 were victims of identity fraud, and this is up from 15,766 in 2014 and is more than double the 11,000 victims in this age bracket in 2010. Because fraudsters can get hold of their victims' personal information, such as name, date of birth, address, their bank, who they hold accounts with, in a variety of ways, including through hacking and data loss, as well as using social media to put the pieces of somebody's identity together. 86% of online identity frauds in 2015 were perpetrated online, and we know that that figure is rising. And interesting emerging evidence seems to suggest that younger people report losing money to fraud more often than older people as scams move online. And we know that older people are more reluctant to report being scammed, but when older people are victims of scams, their losses tend to be much greater. Society, government and industry all have a role in preventing fraud. However, our concern should be the lack of awareness about identity fraud, making it easier for fraudsters to obtain the information they need from social media sites. It's important that we all check our privacy settings today and think twice about what we share on social media. The Honourable Member for Westmoreland and Lonsdale talked about the closure of bank branches, and I think that's a very important point. There is no doubt that banks are trying to force those of us, and I include myself in this, Mr Chair, they're trying to force those of us who have chosen not to bank online to do so. Not, Mr Chair, because it's convenient for us, but because it's convenient for the banks. And I, for one, will not bank online, and I urge those who are not comfortable doing so to similarly resist that pressure. But we've heard today some eminently sensible and straightforward measures that could be taken, such as a more strategic approach, such as safeguards from banks for vulnerable people, that could do much to protect those most at risk of scamming. That is the elderly and the vulnerable in our communities, and reaching out to those of all ages who use social media but do not have the information they need to protect themselves from identity fraud. And I would suggest perhaps we can do more in terms of giving people information, education campaigns to better inform people about how they can take some responsibility and some simple steps to protect themselves, as the Honourable Member for Strangford indicated. I urge the Minister today to reflect on these matters that have been put forward, these suggestions that have been put forward, to help us tackle the problem that confronts people who are robbed in their own homes and subsequently find the experience deeply scarring indeed. The effects are far-reaching. Let us do more. We can do more to protect the victims of scams. The scammers and fraudsters are very creative, and we've heard some examples of that, of how creative they can be today. They're being very creative, they're evolving their scamming techniques, so we need to be creative and evolve our measures about how we can deal with them. In the end, ultimately, we are all at risk, so we need to work together to protect our communities. So I'm very interested to hear what ideas the Minister is going to take forward today.